at some point we have to start looking at the flip of where is state investment valued or important. And that is very important in concerns of where sovereign risk is to be made real. Now, let's be clear. Sovereign risk is also the very vastly abused term of, which I think, Victoria, you've touched upon as well. It is a vastly used term to justify all sorts of action. And we'll touch upon a little bit about how it is to be used very specifically. But DPI as a framing is a reaction which comes from a place of both infrastructure gap as well as sovereign solutions. And in those spaces, the government investment was not just warranted, it was necessary, and it created the ecosystem in the way that it did come in. But fundamentally, the distinction is that unless and until we are able to qualitatively make a distinction between ecosystem investments and company-specific investments, the paper wouldn't really be able to make that distinction and justify as much. I would argue that as we are proceeding, especially in sectors like AI, that distinction is also quickly collapsing. Which brings me to the last point, which is on how we are setting up the ecosystem, assuming that if, let's say, these investments are inevitable and there is a timeline along which these investments are going to continue to happen, what are the checks and balances or the right ecosystem to help enable that in the right manner? So let's say, for example, if you look at the spectrum of investments, the first is extraterritorial sovereign investments. While a lot of the conversation has been toward state investments, we haven't talked about state investments in nations apart from their own, which is in the form of sovereign wealth funds. While it is briefly addressed in the paper, we can all appreciate that we usually see sovereign wealth funds as being a fairly benign character. We see them as investing purely for profit maximization purposes to create a more deeper fund as a better investment opportunities for the state. Now, that is benign and colorless very clearly where it is cross-territorial. For example, Singapore GIC is a very strong investor in several Indian firms, especially Indian fintech firms. The second would be where it is domestic in feature. What are the checks and balances that can be built? For example, the Norwegian fund ensures that the sovereign wealth fund cannot make any investments in the local market. And that makes sense because you do not want the ecosystem where the regulator investor is exactly the same. Which also brings me back to the sovereign concerns. In India, apart from DPI, you do have investments in several AI institutions in India. This is very much a different lens of the same sovereign concern, wherein we do not want to be caught without adequate capabilities for local growth of AI powers. Now, that has resulted in the country, India AI Mission, investing in several countries, including Sarvam, Krujrim, as well as creating a DPI for compute infrastructure. Now, what does that require as a check and balance, making adequate sunset clauses, ensuring neutrality, and I think that's briefly what you're touching upon as well, and putting in place investor regulator firewall, wherein you are not setting the course and playing the game on the same side. Which then brings me to what does it look like when the strategic investment is in regulated sectors, where the state is a shareholder and the customer and the regulator. That does definitely lead to substantial concern. I think rather than painting state investments with a large brush, the query is to ensure that we come up with a constructive solution as to to put it crudely, the so what's. Because if a company, if let's say an OpenAI is excited or interested in having state investment in them, if they don't care, should we? If the investments are made with adequate transparency measures, does that meet our concerns? If they have a sunset clause, and if they are making this investment purely to prop it up as a competitive global force, is that sufficient? I think those are some of those test points on which we have to evaluate what the impact of these investments are, because it is not a one size fits all. While the paper clearly calls out the intent to travel and that the evaluation of the US and Australian markets are purely as examples, I would argue that there are some instances which do not allow it to completely travel in its current framing, which is specifically the ecosystems and the countries where there is a substantial market gap which can be filled substantially by the state, and where there is a sovereign risk where it is important to create a local alternative to existing market forces. And in those instances, the state participation in the market in the form of investment or even creating more favorable market conditions or regulatory conditions are not really the worst thing. There are many states in which the utopian ideal that we are pursuing is not really of a vibrant market, but it is of a vibrant ecosystem of operation for the citizens. So if it takes a bit of state intervention to get there, many states across the world may argue that's a fair trade. And so I leave it there, where overall, these are a couple of my submissions of evaluating the socialism label, revisiting the strategic investments and the ecosystem binary, the anchoring on the regulatory part, which is what are the checks and balances on the invested market, and distinguish sovereign capability catalysts from national champion protection. And I would be very keen to evaluate, any answers or any thoughts on what the solutioning for this very elaborate problem statement looks like. I will take a pause there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Sananya. Would you like to sort of quickly respond before we open it up? I know we're almost out of time, but I'd request if the panelists have the time, if you'd like to respond before we open it up.
Sure thing.
Do you want to say something first?
I just want to say I found that extremely helpful feedback, and I think I have a lot of food for thought. I think those are great points. There is a bit of I will say there was probably we could have dealt with a couple of these points in the paper, but because of there's so much to say.
Sure. Oh, sorry. No, I'm very empathetic to that concern of, just a lot to fit into one document. Yeah.
Yeah, this is the first paper in sort of a series. I will say I think the point about how this sort of quote unquote socialism, we've talked about, to what extent do we define socialism? Part of this is the counterpoint to what the Wall Street Journal has called state capitalism, which I think is, I don't think there's any term that's perfect.